everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Banking Matters. Today is the start of another month episode. So you have Ashton and I both in the studio.
Hey, everybody.
So, Ashton, did you know that today is actually a very special episode?
What?
Yeah, so today we are actually celebrating our 1-year anniversary for the Banking Matters podcast.
Wow. So the full year of people listening to you.
Yeah, I know. I feel sorry for them as well. No, it's been a great year. We've been having a lot of success this past year. We've got a lot of guests on, a lot of episodes churned out, and we were able to meet with a lot of people, discuss a lot of elements that were really important to the banking industry. Some of my favorite episodes, I don't know if you have any action, some of my favorite episodes from this past year were going to be episodes like Peter Madlin, who talked about economic headwinds, Calvin Dunning, community outreach, Paul Cummings. He had some great stories about when he was a special agent for the Treasury and for Homeland Security. And then, of course, the Texas Bankers Association president and CEO, Christopher Lowe. It's always nice to hear from him. He's always got some great ideas and opinions about how banks associations can really provide some valuable resources to banks.
Yeah, I agree. Chris is a great speaker. My favorite episodes tend to have a common theme. So as a VCO, when I think about episodes, I want episodes that have great takeaways that I can forward onto my banks and say, listen to this episode and you're going to get a lesson out of it, right? So my top two are, for that purpose anyway, are probably Eric Collinsworth, who talked about appraisals and reconsideration of value, which is a super hot topic. And Ed Berdzinski, who talked about beneficial ownership and just was chock full of data. But then on a personal note, my absolute favorite episode was, of course, our holiday spectacular with Craig Oslo. And he was so fun and dressed up with me and talked about board member perspective and strategic marketing. So he will forever have a special place in my heart.
So I know that initially, like this project was just kind of rolled out by me, and you later joined me on as a co-host, which has been absolutely great. I've loved having you on as a co-host of the podcast. But how kind of did your perspective change a little bit? I have to ask, from being just a listener into participating and being a host of the podcast.
You know, I have to say I got a little bit more respect for you through this process, because being a host is maybe a little more difficult than you ever made it look, because to kind of guide the conversation where it needs to go is really interesting. And so I would say my perspective changed, because initially listening, like I mentioned earlier, I looked for the episodes with key takeaways that I could pass on to my banks. So that was my focus. Like, what can I pass on that kind of furthers their knowledge without just constantly listening to me talk. But as a co-host now, I think my favorites have shifted to the more fun episodes. You know, maybe it's a softer topic, but really engaging guests. So it has definitely shifted.
So I have to agree with you a little bit on that. One of my favorite parts about being a host of the Banking Matters podcast is really taking the opportunity to get to know the people that are coming on the shows, to get to hold the conversations with them. Because, I mean, we're going through every step of the process with them, all the way from potentially cold contacting them on a third-party site or having them be referred to us or them volunteering to participate, all the way down the lines to producing the episode and everything like that. So it's really kind of cool to get to know people on not only a professional level, but a little bit on the personal level as well, as you're figuring more about their lives and who these people are. But I do have some unfortunate news, Ashton. So, as you know, I've been working on this project now for a while, and with more time spent in meetings and emailing than honestly I really care to admit. However, since we have successfully brought this project and this podcast into the new year, I'm actually going to be taking this opportunity to gracefully bow out as host of the Banking Matters podcast and turn my attention to some other projects.
Dan, this is bad news for all of us, as we have super enjoyed having your guidance, and I have consistently referred to you as the OG podcast host. But I do have to thank you, because I have to say, before Banking Matters, and maybe I shouldn't share this, I'm going to lose all credibility, I had never listened to a podcast. So as a current podcast host now, I can thank you for everything I know about podcasting, because I learned it all from you.
Oh, well, I appreciate that, and then hopefully you learn good skills and good elements from that. But the good news is I'm not going to be leaving you high and dry. We've got somebody that's going to be coming on that's one of the most capable and competent people I know. And so his name's actually Roger Morris, and he's going to be joining us joining you, I should say, as the co-host of the Banking Matters podcast. So Roger, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks, Dan. And first, I just want to congratulate you on 1 year. This is a big accomplishment. I've been a listener since the beginning, and I've really enjoyed it. I'm a big podcast fan in general. Never been on a podcast, first time, so I'm really excited to be here.
Roger, I'm so excited to have you join me. I am confident you will be able to step into Dan's shoes and carry on the torch. But I have to confess, you and I haven't spent a lot of time together. So can you tell me and our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. First thing you need to know about me is I'm a Kentuckian through and through. I bleed blue. Go Big Blue. You'll hear that quite a few times on this podcast. And much like Dan, I have the misfortune of also being a lawyer. I'm also a certified information privacy professional. And I use that to work on Compliance Alliance hotline. So I'm talking with bankers all day, chats, calls, emails, the whole caboodle. And on top of that, I'm also the editor of our in-house magazine, Access Magazine. I'm sure many of your listeners, viewers, have also read our magazine, so I highly recommend that. But when I'm not helping people with compliance, I have a 13-month-old son who just started walking this past weekend, so I'm out of breath, fixing him down, making sure he doesn't crack his head.
So just one son, though, right?
Just the one. You're starting to sound like my mother-in-law. She wants...
No. Listen, Roger,
No.
This is an upgrade because our overall level of children between the hosts is a significant decrease now with the shift from Dan to you. We're going from, 6 in total to 2. So much more manageable for us. Okay, so Roger, between the hotline and the magazine, what is a hot topic or common misconception that you have seen recently?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Ashton. So I actually wrote an article for our February issue. I highly recommend everybody check it out. It's on Regulation E. So, on Hotline, there's kind of seasons for questions. There's a Honda season, but with, Reg E, we get those questions all year round. The most common type of Reg E question is, all right, we had a customer who got defrauded. What do we do now? And there's kind of a little misconception out there. People kind of think and know about the 60-day deadline with error resolution. So, someone's debit card is stolen, she'll either spend, they buy probably gift cards, shows up on your periodic statement, they have 60 days to report to you to initiate an error resolution investigation. And there's a misconception out there that if the customer does not report that within 60 days, then they take the full loss. Well, unfortunately for bankers out there, it is not quite that simple. So, Reg E contemplates this 3-tiered liability situation. So I guess to back up a second, when you have a customer, they have an access device. So there's 2 types of errors that can happen. There's one that happens with an access device and some that happen that do not have an access device. And if there's not one, then that misconception is actually true. If they don't report it within 60 days, they're generally taking the loss. But with access devices, there are additional considerations. And by and large, 99% of the time, it involves a debit card or some other means of access into an account. So I'll just high-level overview of these 3 tiers of liability I think might be helpful, but I go into a lot more detail in our articles. I highly recommend everyone check out Access Magazine. The first tier of liability is reporting an error within 2 days, and this is 2 days from when the customer learned about it. And if they report within 2 days, their liability is capped at $50. You can only shift $50 of liability onto the customer. Second tier of liability is, you're outside that 2-day window, but you're still within the 60-day window for reporting an error that the error resolution rules contemplate. So in that scenario, it's a little bit more complicated, but for our purposes, the cap is $500. And then there's a third tier of liability, and that's when you fall outside of the 60-day window. And when that happens, any errors that occur outside of those first 60 days after you issue the statement, the full liability for those is on them. But you still have to think about first and second tier liability for those first 60 days. So I guess that was a long way of saying, if you have a customer who reports late outside of 60 days, just don't be so quick to say, all right, it's over, we're off the hook. It's quite a bit more complicated than that, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think
so. I was actually jumping really quick. So, Roger, if I remember correctly, you said you're the editor of the Access magazine. Did you publish something about this in the Access magazines that you were saying?
Yes, yeah. This was the feature of our February issue. So
okay, is that available to everyone, or is that available primarily to Compliance Alliance subscribers?
It is free. If you have a Compliance Alliance subscription, it is available, but we also offer subscriptions if you're not a Compliance Alliance member, so you can have an independent subscription. So just because you're not a Compliance Alliance member does not mean you can check out the magazine.
Very good. And I kind of, just to go back to what you said, Roger, I totally agree that it's one of those consumer protection regulations that I was just telling one of my banks yesterday that the mindset we have to get in with all of those is customer friendly, right? Even if it means the bank ends up hosed, it is a customer protection regulation. So there's always that. It's never over for the customer, right? There's always a hidden rule.
Yeah, I always tell members it's just a very customer favorable regulation. So, I mean, if there's a gray area, just err on the side of helping the customer.
I agree. Yep. And then I also get a lot of questions from my banks when it comes to Reg E about the intersection between the Visa and MasterCard rules. That the difference there is, I think, a struggle for a lot of banks.
Yeah, and it's also a big struggle with, these, person-to-person payments, Zelle. I mean, it's, the rules used to be a little bit more clear about, whether or not a bank had an agreement with, one of those providers, but the CFPB and other regulators have got to muddy the waters now. And really, in most cases, if you don't have an explicit agreement with them, there is an implied agreement. And then you have to think about these Reg E rules all over again.
Agree. So something that I have been noticing with not just my banks, but industry-wide is redlining. Do you guys think about redlining a lot?
Yeah, we get questions like that all the time.
Unfortunately, yeah.
So, yeah, when I think about redlining, I usually go back. So when I joined compliance, and I think most of us probably have this default mindset, is you think about bad people, right? That it's like this intentional act, and it's the bad folks that are racist and just overall not very nice, and they're doing this intentional thing to not lend to minorities or in minority areas. And it feels like, okay, if we just hire good people, our risk is probably minimal. But that's not the game anymore. So what I've noticed, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, is modern redlining isn't about overt acts. It's about data. So
jump in really quick, Ashton?
Sure.
Just for our listeners, what is redlining? I mean, that's a phrase that obviously, like, you and I are very familiar with, but what is redlining?
Yeah. So remember that every regulation starts from something, right? And so that's my favorite part of compliance. You have a story. So we have the civil rights movement that came about, and regulators said, hey, banks, you seem to be furthering this unfair treatment to minority folks. And so we see this, what's the word I'm looking for? Concentrations of minorities in certain areas. And we see you banks not lending there. Now, that's a part of your community, and so you should serve your entire community. And so what was happening from the bad actors that I truly think that isn't the case anymore, is, and where the term redlining came from, is they literally like pull out a red marker and kind of X through certain spots on a map.
Don't make wrong areas.
Yeah, exactly. We're not going to do it. And now it's not really like that. We don't really have that sort of overt discrimination, at least not commonly. I'm not going to say that bad folks don't exist, because I'm sure they do. But I think by and large, that's not what happened. That's not what's happening anymore. So to look at redlining risk, we look at HMDA data. So tell me, pop quiz, Roger, Dan, whoever wants to answer, is how can you look at HMDA data? Who can see it? Anybody?
I'm going to let Roger take this one. I'm going to let him jump and see if he's got the answer off the top of his head.
Well, I was hoping Dan would take that one for me. I mean, so who can see HMDA data?
Is it just
Anybody,
on the FFC page? Yeah, it would just
it's
everybody has access
public.
to FFC. Yeah.
Yeah. So HMDA data is totally public. Now, obviously, it is scrubs of identifying information. So you can't see, like, oh, my neighbor paid so much for their house and here's their income. You can't do that theoretically. But if you're a regulator, you don't have to wait for exam time to go look at this HMDA data. And if you're a community group, you can just get it. It's there. And so if you use HMDA data and the census tract information within it to see if a bank is redlining, that's really easy. So that means that what we're seeing in the industry is while banks are getting some exam fluff from this, not fluff, exam criticism, we're also seeing banks that have regulators proactively reach out to them, not at exam time, and say, hey, have you considered your redlining risk? Because it looks like you had it.
Interesting.
And so that's a really scary place to be. And so we have seen an increase in redlining consent orders and enforcement actions and just overall attention in the past couple of years because this data is so readily available. Now it's purely data driven. So you have to look at your data and understand your assessment area and say, okay, I am a HMDA reporter. So naturally I have a branch in an MSA, right? We all know that that is a qualification to be a HMDA reporter. So generally within MSAs, you're going to have some percentage population of majority minority census tracts. And maybe it's low, right? Maybe it's only, 6%. Doesn't matter. You're not exempt. So, and then you say, well, I'm really small. My HMDA LAR is less than 100 lines. Doesn't matter. You're not exempt. You have to look at your proportion of your lending. So what percentage of my lending is to borrowers in majority minority census tracts? And know what your peers are doing. And if there's a discrepancy there, no one's exempt. You're going to be asked about it and sometimes proactively. And so that's kind of my scare tactic on my soapbox thing I'm seeing with a lot of my banks. At least one of them has had that proactive reach out. One had it happen in an exam. And it's not that they have obscenely high proportions of MMCTs, and it's not that they have super high volume. It's just that the numbers weren't on their side.
Well, Ashton, so, this seems like simple. You can look at the data, but what are you seeing banks doing internally? I mean, it's one thing to say, hey, you can look at the data, but are they saying you, make sure you're monitoring the data? How are they internally monitoring this?
Yeah, so a lot of banks will get a software, but you don't have to, right? You need to know where your numbers are and where you're lending. And a lot of banks, the struggle becomes that they don't have a branch location in MMCTs. And so that is a struggle because if you're a customer and you want to get a mortgage loan from a bank, do you go to the one that's next door or do you go to the one 20 miles across town? I mean, that's an easy answer. However, that's no excuse, right? Regulators say, well, you still took this area in your assessment area. So what did you do to overcome that struggle? And the answer consistently is marketing and outreach. So if you as a bank review your data, and I do recommend you do that proactively one way or another, figure out where you're lending. And if you see these gaps, you really do need to address those discrepancies, right? So if you see a weakness, act on it. And so marketing and outreach is the consistent theme throughout consent orders. And that's a struggle, especially for our small banks who say, well, we don't really market. Okay, well, you'll have to start thinking about that because that's one of the only ways to address this branch location discrepancy that you probably have, is my guess. And that's probably the root cause of this overall application discrepancy. But you have to show you're trying, right, to help bolster that claim that it's not intentional redlining and that you have an effective compliance management system to address these weaknesses. So with that, Dan, you're leaving the podcast in Roger and I's very semi-capable hands, probably. Any final words?
Very capable hands, Ash. Very capable hands. It's been an enjoyable year. I'm grateful for the chance, the opportunities that I've had to really work into this project, to this podcast. And thank you very much as listeners for tuning into this episode. We hope that you found the past year really enjoyable and enlightening as we have. So although you may see my face crop up a time or two more as some of the episodes continue to filter out, For the most part, I'll be passing this baton on to Roger, who will be continuing as the new co-host of the podcast. So with that, I'll take one last opportunity to say that's Banking Matters.